I don't think you asked, because that's
Yeah, that's why I create a cool video.
Put it down. Pull it off and put it down. Just pull it off and set it. Turn it down. Yeah.
Nice. Keep it right there.
I was trying. Right, thank you.
I used like a train. My story was completely off the train, so now I need to figure out how to get it back on the train. I need to put it on the train. I need to put like one car after the other and have it go down the track. So right now it's just nobody wants to get on this. I don't know, it's fine. It's fine. But I just need to like bring in the basic issues about the train. Yeah, because there's a text website. Yeah. There, I said it so all the time.
Hello, everyone. Happy Saturday. Yes, Saturday. Yes, it's Saturday. Thanks for coming in today. Excuse me. We have a super awesome masterclass event that I don't know if we held in a while. Oh, hang on. Sorry. So we're excited to have everyone in. How many of you guys, this is your first kind of Tattered cover event that you've been to? Yay, welcome. Well, welcome in. So exciting. My name is Kat Long, I'm the director of events for Tattered Cover Bookstore. We have a couple of things on your seats for the course, but we also have our January events calendar up here and at different registers upstairs. So if you want to know what else is going on at all of our 4 different locations this month, feel free to pick up a calendar. Follow us on social media, email to or sign up to our email list, do all the things. We've got a lot of fun stuff coming up. Things I'm not allowed to talk about yet, but lots of cool things happening. Lots of things like author conversations, community events like this that are free for everybody, book clubs, writers clubs, off-site events, lots of things that Tattered Cover loves to connect authors with readers and writers. So Thank you for showing up today. Today we have Marisa Cardin, Michael Rockman, and Maddi Bluhme. If you see it, we are missing one person, and that's because Thomas is off winning awards for some films that he's been doing. So he was really bummed to miss this. We were bummed to not have him today. And we were trying to figure out if we could do something virtually, but just it wouldn't have worked out with our technology as of right now. So we're super excited to have these three. Please support them in any way. They're not getting paid to do this. They're here out of the goodness of their beautiful hearts. So we do actually have their books back here that they're selling directly to you. So if you buy their works, they actually get all of the proceeds from that. So we'll have plenty of that afterwards. And just remember to connect with each other. Writing is sometimes a lonely space. So we're here to get to know each other, get to know our wonderful writers and authors and teachers today. So feel free to hang out afterwards to chat with everybody. All right, let's get started.
All right, thank you.
Oh, sorry, I forgot about one thing. Okay, Michael is actually live streaming this from his YouTube channel. So it's over here, but if you want to avoid being visual, just avoid this area over here. Okay?
Not like us, we can't avoid this.
No, they can't.
All right. All right, hi guys, how's it going? We're super excited to be here today talking to you guys all about world building, how to create a believable and relevant world for your sci-fi and fantasy stories. So let's get started. If you don't already know me, my name is Marisa. I'm the author of the Shadowrunners trilogy. It's a sci-fi kind of political story. I have the first one up here, the second one back here, and then the third one comes out at the end of April. So super excited / really nervous about that.
My name is Maddi, and I'm the author of this book, the first in the WriterSanctuary trilogy, which is a dystopian fantasy. So, yeah.
I'm Michael Brockbank. I'm the author of Kingmaker. It's a dark fantasy series. Second book should be out in the next month or two. And I'm also the founder of WriterSanctuary, which is a website and YouTube channel that I created to help freelancers, bloggers, and self-published authors write about.
All right, so we're just gonna jump right into it. I'm assuming, do I need to talk closer? Okay. Assuming that everybody here, you're all kind of creatives, right? You might be working on your own stories that you need world building for, or you're just here because you're interested in learning more. So we're gonna go ahead and define world building real fast. It's the process of creating a fictional world with its own rules, places, and government, etc. So yeah, there's a ton of different stuff that goes into it, so hopefully all of this is helpful to you guys, whether you're working on something right now and you're not kind of sure where to go from here, or you're just starting to build something and you don't even know where to start. So hopefully this all is helpful to you guys. So a couple things that world building can involve. We're going to be building the geography, the flora, the fauna, so that's the plants and animals of the world, the inhabitants, that can be mythical creatures that exist on Earth, creatures you guys are making up, or humans, alien races, stuff like that, and then technology. You can talk about developing a culture, social customs, invented language. That's my favorite thing, so I'm going to be talking about that a little bit more later. And then defining the style of government. An important thing to keep in mind with that is you want to be focusing on what your characters think about the government. So like in the Hunger Games, they really don't like the Capitol, right? And that's kind of feeding into the story that Suzanne Collins was telling. Establishing the world's history, laws of nature, physics. And yeah, it can be as simple as altering the details of the world that we live in, right? All of our readers, they kind of are functioning from being on Earth, living on Earth, so that's where they're going to be coming to your story with. Or it can be as complex as creating a whole new universe. So how can it help your sci-fi fantasy writing? How can world building kind of create a deeper story for your readers to become involved in? So really what world building does is it deepens your characters, right? It deepens your plots. It's going to help hook your reader from the very beginning of the story. It's going to add depth and complexity to your characters' motivations and conflicts. So once your world really grows, it's not so much your characters like flat and they're in their own space. They're living in this whole world that's kind of a character in itself. So really, it's just helping your story come to life. All right, so a bit of an overview real quick of what we're going to be talking about today. And this is all in the printouts. You guys have, if you don't have one on your seat, you can grab one from an empty seat. We've got some other copies up here. And if we run out after that, I'll email you one. So I'm going to be going over kind of some different world building methods that you can use if you're not sure where to start, or if your story has started but you kind of don't know where to go from there. So this is going to be talking about setting up boundaries. That's how your world is going to function like it's a real world. And then Maddi's going to go over some cultural and societal reflection points. That's going to be talking about depth and nuance and how that can build your story even deeper. Michael's going to go over some dialogue and language and how you can kind of build your world further through the dialogue, through your characters talking together, and how that's going to really just make the world a better place for your characters and for yourself as a writer, for your readers to want to live in. And once you have kind of all of those 3 points together, your world is really it's really functioning as its own thing now. It's its own character, it's living, it's breathing. Your characters know the rules of your world, you know the rules of your world as you're writing, so you're really able to understand the world as you're writing in it more. And that's really just going to help you discover some more world building details as you're writing in that world. So, does anybody know what the Goldilocks zone is? Someone in the back knows it. Do you want to shout it out?
Is it basically one of those stories where it's like you're the main character and you're kind of either away or somewhere and you're kind of waiting for I guess I guess the main character isn't waiting, but basically there's someone coming to save you and then you go on an adventure or something? Is that what it is?
Not quite.
Oh yeah, I'm thinking of Rapunzel. I'm so sorry.
No, you're so good. You're so good. I'll talk to you more about that. Where I was kind of going with it was in science, the Goldilocks zone is what we like to call where Earth resides in the solar system. So in the story, in Goldilocks and the Three Bears, right, the porridge isn't too hot, it's not too cold, it's just the right temperature for Earth. So Earth is kind of in this area in the solar system where it's not too close to the sun for no life to exist, and it's not way so far away that it's way too cold for life. So you want to make sure that your story when you're building your world is in kind of the same zone. And what I mean by that is if there's way too much chaos and not enough rules, your reader doesn't know what's happening, you feel like you don't know what's happening as a writer, your reader's going to be distracted, right? They're going to be reading the story and they're going to be like, okay, I don't know what's going to happen next. And not in the good plot twist way, in no, I really don't know what's going to happen next. So that being too close to that side kind of makes it so your reader's distracted and they don't know what's going on. And then on the other side, if it's too rigid and there's way too many rules, your reader's also distracted. Your characters don't feel like they can kind of go anywhere. They're just stuck, right? They don't know where to go next. So it's an important rule of thumb to kind of keep the important rules that make sense to the story you're trying to tell, but also leave some room for surprises, right? Surprises for yourself as a writer, for your readers. Those are the really important good plot twists. So yeah, important to make sure your world building is kind of in that just right zone. So how do we find the Goldilocks zone? You ask yourself questions. There are so many different websites that I've found as a writer that are 20 different world building questions, 10,000 world building questions you can ask yourself. And those are an awesome starting point, but all of those questions might not make sense for the specific story that you guys are telling. So these are just some questions that kind of relate to any story. I find myself coming back to these questions whenever I'm starting a new project. Stuff like, what is their government, religion, culture? Are these things corrupt? Are they awesome and perfect and we live in a utopia? I know that me and Maddi have religion in our stories and they're super bad, no, corrupt. Is there a magic system and what are the rules of that magic system? These can be literal or cultural rules. An example of that would be in Harry Potter they have all these unforgivable curses, and a literal rule would be okay, the characters have the ability to perform a Vada Kedavra and kill someone who cut them off in traffic or on the broom or whatever. Culturally, they probably should not be doing that. So literal and cultural rules are important to remember. Do your main characters like their world is another good point. My book takes place on a desert planet and Jax, the main character, hates it. And that started as a small detail, and that kind of informs his character as the series go on. So that's an important question to ask yourself. And also, I feel like there's like no good story where, at least from the stuff that I read, there's like no good story where the characters like the world, because that's like where the tension comes in. Why does your story/world need to exist? And that might not be something that you know right away when you're starting to world build. That's probably going to be something you're finding out as you go along later. I know Maddi's going to talk about that a little bit more with like nuance of depth and like this idea of reflecting the society that we live in with your story, but important to keep in mind as you go along. And then the most important question that we'll probably repeat a billion times today is, how is this world similar to ours, and how is it different from ours? So just keep that in mind as we go along. So another method that you guys can use to kind of start world building is called the iceberg method. Brandon Sanderson kind of coined this and is a big believer in it. If you don't know, he wrote Mistborn, Way of Kings. He's like a powerhouse in the fantasy world building community. But the idea is that if you have an iceberg, you're only seeing like 20% of the iceberg, the stuff that's above the surface, and like 80% of it is all of the stuff that's below the water, right? So in terms of world building, we want to remember that the world building you show is the 20% that the reader sees, the stuff that's above the water. And the world building you imply, the stuff that you're implying through text, through dialogue, through characters, all that stuff, foreshadowing, that's all going to be below the surface. So some of that stuff could be just as simple as like you're writing a detail of a character in a notebook. Nobody ever sees it, but you know it. You're implying it through the text, and so that's kind of where it's going to live, and that's okay. You don't need to be spoon-feeding your readers every single detail, because if you're implying the world building through the text, they're not going to need all of it laid out for them. And that's like kind of the fun of reading and discovering the world, right? So just keep in mind that your characters and your plot and your story are going to grow and change throughout the writing process. So you don't need to build every detail at once. As tempting as it is to sit down and write a 500-page history about your world, you don't need to do it. I want to do it, but that kind of takes away from writing time, right? So just start with the important details and kind of go from there. So an example that I like to use for kind of implying world building through the text, there's a really brief moment. Oh, it's cut off so you can't see, but I'll read it. There's a really brief moment in like the second chapter of my first book where Jax, the main character, is talking about how he doesn't like his home planet, it's a desert planet. And he says, Andartia wasn't always a desert planet. And so kind of what I was trying to do with that sentence, especially with the wasn't always part, I was trying to imply that maybe we should start questioning, maybe we should start asking ourselves questions about why he doesn't like it so much. Does he not like the planet because he's just a teenage boy and is angsty or whatever, or does he have a better reason to not like that planet? So I was really trying to push the readers to kind of just start questioning it a little bit. So stuff like, how did Andartia become a desert planet? It's important to kind of remember that all of our readers, the stuff that they're reading, they're learning it in the context of being from Earth. We're all from Earth, we don't live on Andartia, thank God. So in this day and age, we've got a lot of climate change, stuff like that, not to go on that tangent. So it's making the readers wonder, did the Andartians mistreat their planet? If it wasn't always a desert planet, it must have been an Earth-like planet, right? So how did it get there? How did it get to be a desert? And that makes them wonder, can we trust the Andartians? And I was kind of trying to, through all these little questions that pop up, I'm trying to get the reader to ask the overarching theme of the trilogy, which is, who are the real bad guys? So that's just an example of how you can kind of imply world building through just a super brief moment in the text. You don't have to go into it super deeply. And that's a good way to kind of get started with implying world building, rather than just showing all of it all at once. So, speaking of small, it's important to kind of remember, hello? Well, imagine that's a map of Narnia. It's important to remember to start small and build out. So actually this kind of works. C.S. Lewis, when he was writing the Chronicles of Narnia, he started with just this tiny little area. And you can suspend your disbelief and imagine that all of this other stuff is the map that eventually he got to work with, right? So yeah, just start with the most important details and kind of build out from there. He didn't need to be focusing on all the stuff that was below or above Narnia or whatever until way later books. One example of how I kind of did this with my book was there were so many things that happened before this first book even took place. They left Earth, they colonized other planets, there was a giant resource war, and then at the bottom of that sticky note I have I wanted to remember what my main characters meant because I'm sounding like that. And they're in love and stuff, so. But yeah, that sticky note those are just like some small examples of how I was kind of able to start small and build out from there. I just had these like details that I knew were going to happen before the book took place, and from there I was able to build out and know my characters a little bit better. So I'm moving this week, and I'm going through all of like my old journals and sketchbooks and stuff and getting rid of stuff. I'm keeping this, but this was a picture of a motorcycle that I drew when I was like 10 years ago when I first started thinking of this story, because one of the only details I knew about West, this character, that's his bike, was that I wanted him to ride a motorcycle. Partially because I'm afraid of motorcycles in real life and I wanted my characters to be cooler than I am. But through just like focusing on this one detail of, okay, West is gonna ride on this motorcycle. I know that he has this motorcycle. I know that he's living on this kind of like abandoned, ravaged planet with not a lot of resources. And I know I want it to be sci-fi, right? So I know he's gonna kind of get it into a hover bike sort of situation. And through having that detail, I was able to ask myself questions of like, okay, if he's doing all of this, if he's able to construct this bike by himself without all of these resources, he must be pretty smart. He must be pretty, better at building than I am. So by just having that detail and having that visual in front of me, I was able to build his character even more. And from there, I was able to build the world that he's living on even more. And that's not to say you have to use concept art and draw it yourself, because I can't draw people to save my life, but I can draw like that stuff and like my cats, because I have 4 cats, so I can draw them all day. But even like using like a Pinterest board and having kind of like the vibe of the story you're trying to tell, she's like, yeah, that's super helpful. I have so many Pinterest boards with ideas that I'll probably never like fully construct, but it's really fun to kind of have that visual in front of you to like know where you're going from there. So I'll leave you guys for now with a quote from Brandon Sanderson. He says, most readers will latch on to one idea done really well better than 100 ideas that are just barely touched on. So going back to that idea of just starting with what you know, starting with the one detail, the motorcycle that I know is going to have stuff to do with the story 3 books later, and just focus on that.
So once you have a good foundational understanding of the kind of world you want to create and like the physics and physical features of that material world, then you start looking at adding nuance and depth. And this is best explored through cultural and societal reflection. So in addition to talking about adding nuance and depth to the overarching world building, I'll also touch on adding this part of world building and showing it through character, because the character aspect will do a lot of heavy lifting when it comes to this concept. So when you think of cultural and societal reflection, you can ask yourself, what am I saying with my world building? In Lisa Cron's Wired for Story, which is an amazing reference book if you are looking for one, she states a large part of what readers skim, if not skip entirely, is scenery, setting, weather. Why? Because because stories are about people, the things that happen to them, and how they react to it. So that's not to say that your world building and scenery are unimportant, because they are fundamental. It just means that without depth and nuance, it becomes separate from the story that you are trying to tell. So if you take Game of Thrones, George R.R. Martin's world building is expansive and detailed to the point where he can point out inconsistencies from his books to the show. And know exactly where they went wrong. And people love Westeros, but they love Westeros because of the Game of Thrones that the characters are in. They enjoyed seeing the Northern Starks go south to King's Landing and watch them try to stay alive as the odds were stacked against them, and then of course everything that happened afterwards. So people fall in love with your world because of how the characters exist in your world. So whether you are taking the time to explicitly build that world building through the text or showing it through your characters, you need that nuance and depth to make it feel real and lived in. As Marisa stated earlier, the majority of your world building will be directly stated in your text. So if you are into like the social sciences and concepts from there, this is more the sociological part of your world building, because so much of our real world culture is defined by how we act within the larger group. Our collective experience influences our morals, our belief systems, and even our actions. So if you think about the real world, there is a mainstream culture that dictates a lot of what we think, and how we act. And we know that these beliefs are largely cultural because they change from one culture to the next. The culture we grow up in also dictates how we fight back against mainstream ideals that are considered brutal, outdated, problematic, etc. None of us fell out of a coconut tree. We're all connected, so the same should be true for your characters in your story world. When you don't have a world that informs the characters' choices, the reading experience can feel jarring and awkward. Have you ever read a story where the world is set up to be very historical, often patriarchal, yet the protagonist might hold 2020s morals and beliefs? It tends to just feel a little bit odd because what our understanding of history doesn't coincide with someone from like the 1600s holding a 2020s belief. And so I like to use the concept of cultural relativism, and that is just defined as we're not judging a culture to our own standards of what is right or wrong, strange or normal. Instead, we should try to understand cultural practices of other groups in their own cultural context. So if you want to explore classism, where you have structures that you've put into your world that support the ruling rich class, and you would have to think about how a rebel would realistically understand that the ruling class is hurting them, causing harm, and then how they would then oppose that ruling class. And it may or may not look exactly like our world, and that's totally okay. So with that in mind, let's get into the definitions and the makeup of your world's cultural landscape. So depth is the physical and cultural attributes of your world and setting that influence the characters, their beliefs, and their actions. You can think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You start with deciding what type of housing and architecture your world has, is how they access water, and then you can move on to family structures, religions, laws, and governing systems. So remember, your physical world will influence those more ephemeral topics like religion and governance, and we can see this in real world history. So while Babylon and Egypt weren't terribly far away from each other, there was still enough of a geographic distance to result in wildly different explanations for their gods. Babylonians had less fertile land with worse weather conditions, so their gods were more crueler and more vindictive than Egyptian gods, whose people had the fertile Nile River Valley. Obviously, neither group was all-knowing, so that leads us into nuance. Nuance is defined as a subtle difference in or shade of meaning, expression, or sound. So nuance in language might show in the familiarity of language you use when you're talking to someone, or whether you have enough context to determine if someone is being sarcastic or not. So nuance is also very popular when discussing something that might be a legal crime but not a moral crime. And I think it's easiest to explain and understand using the trolley car problem. If you don't know any of these people, you might decide to take out the one person to save 5 lives. But if I told you that it was one dearly beloved family member and 5 strangers, you might hesitate or make a different choice. Or if I told you it's 5 people that you love, but this one person is a doctor who's going to cure all cancer, again, you might struggle to make that choice. So those variations and changes that lead to different outcomes, that's all nuance. Nuance is very important in your world building, because how many people do you personally know every single thing there is to know about this world and agree on it? Probably 0. There's the truth of the world as it is, and then there's the truth of how each of your characters experiences it. So that small experience will motivate each character's choices separately and will likely lead to tension and misunderstandings between one another. When this is done well, you have villains that you may not agree with, but you can understand. Everyone has their own motive, and it makes sense. When you don't have this balance, that's when you have those cartoonishly evil villains that feel more evil for the sake of being evil, and giving your hero the chance to be a hero rather than being an individual, organization, faction, whatever, that is acting of their own free will. So here's another quick nuance lesson. Unless you've been offline for the past decade, I'm sure you're well aware of the infamous white, gold, black dress. So raise your hand if you see white and gold. Dang, really? And raise your hand if you see blue and black.
Oh, nice.
So this is a great foundation for nuance. However you see the dress, you are correct. I see white and gold. So the dress itself is actually blue and black, but the image is all the way overexposed. So when I see white gold, I see the image as it is. And if you see blue and black, your brain is correcting the image, so that's why you see blue and black. But either is technically wrong. So visualizing this and seeing how people can see things differently, you can use that to inform when writing either the same event from multiple different POVs, or if you have an event that happened prior to the story, like a war, that's the same thing could have happened to multiple people, but they're going to take different things and interpret it differently. So here are just some other questions to help you in your world building journey. How do my characters build their moral compass? How does the physical landscape affect culture? And what life events has each character lived through, and how does that shape their thoughts and actions? Are your characters susceptible to propaganda? And how does their location and culture influence those beliefs? So why are they important? They are important because it gives credibility to your world. If you read something where everyone just agrees with the way things are and they don't have those tensions in misunderstandings, it's probably going to be fairly boring, and it really sticks out to you and your brain, or it just does not feel, you don't really have that suspension of disbelief. It also allows your characters to embody the space that they take up. When you have flat world building, you tend to have flat characters because they're confined to this two-dimensional space. It allows for tension and conflict to build, which is the point of almost every story. That conflict is why we're reading, and we want to see how it's resolved. So you need to allow for that to organically build within your story. If everyone experienced the same thing in the same way with no variation, that would be very, very boring. It would be Squidville through and through, and even Squidward hated it. So you got to have some differences in there. I really think that readers are also beginning to burn out on low world building. If you can think of the last thing you read that had world building that felt pretty cardboard, it was either like pretty shallow or it just didn't make that much of a difference in the lives of characters, it most likely faded from your awareness pretty quickly. So as you build your world, ask yourself, how is my world unique, and how does it aid the message, theme, and journey that my characters go on? So you don't have to make everything different from the real world for this cool fate. I used technology and terminology that was very similar to the US, so I could focus on themes of power, ego, religious hierarchy, and oppression versus the majority. So focus on the parts of world building that highlight your themes, genre, and character rather than trying to like make everything different for each character. So when you go to start adding it into your story, focus on what's important. For this cool fate, that was power and political and religious power. Since it's based around the idea of exploring the aftermath of like 2010's YA dystopia, I'm focusing on themes that those books carried through and leaving blank spaces like reality TV and holidays, you know, things that aren't adding to my message and characters. Think about possible consequences of your choices in the real world. We don't exist in a vacuum, so even if you are writing about a galaxy far, far away, we're all from Earth, so we take all of those experiences with us into every piece of media that we interact with. So if you are exploring themes of oppression, there's a lot of real life oppression, so depending on how you engage with that, it can pull up themes of real things that have happened to real people. And so you just have to think about, am I pulling too much in one direction where it's going to just pull up something like with American history? Are you pulling up slavery? Like that's going to be a very heavy topic. And so you just have to decide how you are communicating that oppression and whether or not you are doing so in a way that is like holding weight or just kind of using it as a vehicle for something small to happen. Because people, once your story is out into the world, people are going to have opinions. So I think you just want to make sure that you can defend the choices that you've made in a way that makes you feel comfortable. Subtext is your friend. Since so much of your world building will live in notebooks and Word documents, subtext allows you to infuse the text with the spirit of your world building without having to explicitly state it. In Marisa's Jack's Castaway series, in the first book, her protagonist Jax is starting to question the history of Andartia, and he finds this small biological oasis on his desert planet. So that is a subtextual example of him breaking free of the rigid history that he grew up with, without it being like explicitly stated and like beating you over the head with it. Think about family structures, beauty ideals, justice, propaganda, and biases. And you can also take advantage of using smaller scale groupings like the family as a microcosm for the larger culture and society, so you don't have to be like explaining everything all the time. You can just focus in on one aspect and it implies the rest of your world building. And you also do not need everything for a believable world. Barbenheimer pretty much defined Summer 23, but Oppenheimer does not exist in the Barbie universe, and Barbie does not exist in the Oppenheimer universe. Just remember that the real world is too vast for any one person to create a perfect one-to-one creation. And oftentimes when you have small blank spaces in the world building, that can work to your advantage as well. I'm not saying the world building of Star Wars is like perfect. However, if George Lucas wanted to think of every single thing for every planet and species, he'd still be sitting at his desk writing notes, and we would not have like 50 years of Star Wars. Instead, he focused on the important things to highlight the Skywalker saga, and all of the loose bits were lovingly taken up by the fans, and they were able to imbue those spaces with their own theories and thoughts, and that really became a driving force of creating the fandom surrounding the work. So giving people something to think about in a good way that keeps their minds in your story is great. From a purely commercial standpoint, we're in the attention economy, so a rich, believable world with enough to think about and keep readers in it is a good return on your investment. So adding or showing all of that depth and nuance through a character, you can think about if you had a war or other large event in your story, do your characters suffer from the effects of that event? If it was a war, do they suffer from PTSD? Do they have any physical reminders? If they cannot hear loud noises without getting horrific flashbacks, that is showing your world building. and providing more depth to the real impact that the war has on your people. In the Fallout TV show, everyone is living from the effects of the bombs, just in very different ways. The characters that were alive during that bombing have a different understanding of the world than the Vault people do. And each Vault was so different that there isn't a lot of overlap of experience in that either. So what you are presented with is a rich and varied world that is compelling. It presents and asks different moral questions without having to state them. And it presents conflict and character interactions that leave you on the edge of your seat. You're asking yourself if Lucy will be able to overcome her naivete. Will she survive the harshness of being outside of her vault? And as you go further into the series and learn more along with Lucy, you also begin to question your understanding of who was right and who was wrong. Were the original villains presented the same villains by the end of the season? And how did the presentation of that information influence your beliefs about the characters? So one of my favorite, very recent examples of world building and nuance in character is Katniss versus Coriolanus in The Hunger Games and Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. Our first introduction to Katniss is very similar to our first introduction of a young Coriolanus. They're both poor, they're both impacted by the war between the capital and the districts, and they're fairly similar in personality. They care about 1 to 2 people and pretty much just like everyone else. Of course, they are different. Coriolanus is a smooth talker, Katniss is kind of surly, but overall, there's a lot of similarities. And through the course of the books, the variations in their experiences of their world have them make very different choices, even though those choices are pretty similar. Collins presents the same moral question for each of them. Is love and community enough to stand up to the oppressors? In Katniss's case, it's yes, and in Coriolanus's case, it's no. So both stories explore how oppression survives in a very brutal world, and we get a sense of the brutality through the experiences of these characters. And while Coriolanus is not morally good, he makes for an understanding and compelling character. And when you have characters that are mirroring each other like this, you start to ask, or you as the reader start to ask yourself, would I have done the same or would I have chosen differently? And good world building will have your readers asking those same questions as well. If we were in this character's world experiencing what they experience, would I do the same? Would I be better or would I be worse? So these are good books and movies to study if you want to learn about how presenting similar-ish people and similar-ish circumstances can still lead to very different stories. So I'll end off with just one quote that I use when I think about world building. And it's, we don't write about the horrors of war. No, you write about a kid's burnt socks lying in the road. I use that to think about how I can condense all of my world building and all of the history of the world and my characters into the action and dialogue in a way that still sounds natural, which leads us to showing world building through dialogue, which Michael will take over.
Change glasses. Anyway. Okay. So who here has either heard or read dialogue that made you cringe? I know I have. In fact, I can't watch anime because of the dialogue. It drives me absolutely nuts. Even though, in reality, the dialogue is part of the experience, but I just can't get into it. But nonetheless, dialogue can easily make or break a scene or an entire book. So, what can you do to make sure that you don't make someone cringe? Well, first of all, incorporates behaviors and mannerisms directly affect how someone speaks. So sarcasm, lightheartedness, brooding, and being cavalier all have different patterns to their speech and their choices of words and use. I'm quiet, I'm sorry. Educational levels will also play a role in how someone speaks. For instance, one of the characters in Kingmaker is curious and blunt with his statements and questions to the point of making others uncomfortable about it. She makes him a very fun character to write. Bottom line is that no two people will ever speak the same. And not everybody has the same experiences or the same education when they're facing their face-to-face. Crap. And also keep in mind that, I already read that. Life experiences, education, religion, upbringing, all of these can influence how someone speaks. So we don't need to crawl too deep into the weeds with it. Relevant to the plot, knowing these things can be extremely helpful in creating a realistic dialogue. Even identical twins will have separate behaviors and mannerisms in some cases. Okay, so I might be dating myself here, but who knows who P.B. Herman is? Oh, a lot more than I thought. Well, how about Olaf and Frozen? Well, the reason why I bring them up is that there's a big difference between a high energy character and one that speaks like he's a Rugman Valley. Those are all going to be different. They can be done through word choices. Like, makes it a little bit better for people. It's not just the tone that denotes the energy or depression, but you are used slow and low, but also the words that you use. Not to mention how you depict the speech after the dialogue. For instance, he said is different from he said, lowering his voice to nearly a whisper. Planning out the character is extremely beneficial, especially for me. I use the planning board in movies to create characters. It has quite a few different things you can do to really flesh out that specifically irritating. But I've also used notepads, Dungeons and Dragons character sheets, Word documents to create character bios that include behaviors and mannerisms with everything I write. But if you're a pantser, which the difference between a pantser and a plotter is, a plotter will go through and outline the entire story or even a whole chapter, and the pantser just writes the seat of the pants. There's no right or wrong way, whatever works best for you. But as a pantser, you'd want to take copious notes of the character that you develop, because it'll help with consistency and continuity later on. Because if you don't have that continuity, you're going to lose your reader and they won't believe the character. So you have to be very careful. You also want to be true to the character's nature. There's a difference between nature and demeanor. The character's nature is how they are in real life for themselves. Their demeanor is how everybody else perceives them. So you can have a character that has a glowing nature, but a rotten demeanor. But you want to be true to that as your story progresses. Because as I said, continuity is vastly important. All right, one of my favorite things is slang, dialect, broken, and accented tones of voice. These are various elements of speech, and what elements of speech do your characters portray. So, like in the example here, you can replace being with in or you with ya. But there's all kinds of different ways you do it. Like in this case I have, instead of for, it's per. What I'm doing with this is inferring an accent within the character's speech. Because it's when you're world building, you have all these different parts of your giant world that you're fleshing out. Is there a difference of dialect or accents depending on the different regions that you're creating? So like in the United States, the southern draw is much different from a Wisconsin accent by far. So you can also incorporate that into your world. And don't be afraid to rip off the real world. We've all done it. Does your dragon speak with a slight Scottish accent? I was going to put dragon heart in there, and you can go about it. But that's an example of ripping off the real world. Let's see, but you can use your own slang in places, like your fantasy or sci-fi world doesn't have to be a one-to-one English. Like Battlestar Galactica, here's seen in 2003 Battlestar Galactica. So like when I say frack, you know exactly what that is. So that's an example of replacing a word with something that was completely made up, mostly to get around the censorship, but it worked. Firefly has a lot. Firefly, like running or running, shining, or atom. However, they also incorporate a lot of Mandarin into their scenes, which probably went around the section again. But they use their own slang or slurs to imply what's describing what's going on and what they're replacing. And you don't have to say that what frack actually means throughout the speech when you watch Bowser are going to make. You know exactly what they're replacing. But also, being grammatically correct. How many people do you know speak grammatically correct? I don't. I've been doing this since 2013. I am a far better writer than I am a speaker, obviously. But I don't know a single person who actually speaks with 100% grammatical accuracy. Your dialogue, you don't want that in dialogue because even if Grammarly or programming aid, but they'll say that you need to change certain words, ignore them, because you want real people don't speak grammar. So, okay. The point is that you don't have to put a lot of effort into making sure your dialogue is grammatically sound. In fact, it's more realistic if it's not. And researching real-world instances, like I said before, is great when you're building a fantasy world. Like for me, Star Trek Finland seems more like German with a forceful accentuation of specific sounds. In my book, Kingmaker, I use a twisted variant of Latin for the verbal parts of magic. Essentially, I would look up what the spell was to accomplish, a translation tool, and then add my own spin to it. So it's not exactly one-to-one with Latin, but it is derived from Latin. So that's a bit of visual. In fact, I think Harry Potter has some of that too. It's not exactly
All the
Latin, but if you look at the spells in Harry Potter, a lot of it is derived from Latin. So I guess I can't admit that. Just rub it everywhere. Right, but Marisa will go into deeper into languages. But researching Earth dialects can be extremely beneficial for making it your own. And then, I don't know, did we get off? Now we're going into the having a balance in your pacing of your story is important. You don't want your book to read too fast, which is telling, but you don't want it too slow, which is showing. There's such thing as adding way too much detail to a book. Because the details affect the pacing, and you don't want to spend 3 or 4 pages describing someone's gift. That's just long-winded and no routine. The dialogue will help quicken the pace. It makes it for a faster read, which is why dialogue is usually preceded by longer descriptions and showings. Don't be afraid to add movement after dialogue, but you don't want to be too descriptive either. He said, speaking. Although movement slows the story down a bit, it can be used to accentuate the dialogue through action. Just don't show too much in the middle of a conversation. Unless you're being shorter and concise words help. Unless you're writing a medical journal or a science paper, keeping the words shorter and concise make for an easier read while making the pace quicker. Being an author isn't about showing off usage of a thesaurus or an encyclopedia. It's about delivering a great story and an experience for your reader. Nobody cares if you graduated college with 9 degrees and can cite half the dictionary. Nobody can read it. They shouldn't have to spend too much time in Google. This is what happens. So showing too much makes for a long. What happens when there are too many details within the dialogue. Now I had a problem with this in the very beginning, and editors hated when I would have a solid paragraph of description in the middle of a conversation. So like, I'd ended with a question, and the secretary was supposed to answer, but there's a paragraph of stuff that's going on. They didn't like that, so don't do that. So it's something I can't stress enough when it comes to dialogue. It's okay to add some movement to it, because that gives the story life, but you don't want it to be a paragraph. That's too much. Okay, so separating characters. Dialogue can differentiate character speech. Sure, you can use Joe said, Bob said on every other line, or Joe can speak with a hell of a southern draw, which highlights your speaking. So But like in the topic example on the top right there, this is actually cut from my next book that's coming out. But as you can see, the section that's highlighted is from a character that's completely separate from the other one who was speaking. And later on, that paragraph I stopped using pronouns altogether because you can obviously tell who was speaking each line. Then you want to keep actions of the speaker isolated. This is something else that I got in trouble with editors quite often in the very beginning. The actions of one character shouldn't be mixed with the same paragraph of the speech of another. So depending on how those sentences are structured, it can create a lot of confusion. Like the example I have here is actually directly from my website. Where the first person speaking, I don't think that's appropriate, he said, period. The woman picked up her glass of wine from the table. So that's two different characters doing two separate things on the same paragraph. I got hit a lot for it. And then wife, if it tastes good, she said, if it's what said from the glass, he picked up the tongs up from near the, so it's again, missing the two together. So definitely keep them separated. And lastly, my pro tips. Reading it out loud. So when you read a line out loud, you can hear what it will essentially sound like in somebody's head. The way your brain processes information changes when you start making it for speech. Instead of just reading it and absorbing it, it's going in, translating it for speech and coming back out. So if it makes you cringe, rewrite it. I've been doing that for years now because of the audiobook. In fact, I have it. Yeah, I have it. Okay. So reading aloud helps you find grammatical errors and inconsistencies in writing in general. Like when I do the audiobook of Despair, which is on YouTube, I'll go through it about 3 or 4 times. My editor will go through it about 2 or 3 times. And then as I'm recording it, reading it out loud for the recording, I will still find problems with it. So reading out loud, I can't stress enough how beneficial it is. And then number 2, I probably don't necessarily have to, but act out your scenes because I've made myself cry a lot of times in my books. I'll act out in a lot of scenes in my books, mostly to ensure that they are realistic. So like, most of the time it's the dialogue. Like I'll have conversations with myself, and if it sounds okay, and I sometimes will actually change my voice to higher pitch for people. I have to make sure it's right.
You can just call one of us next time.
I should. Read this part for me. But, however, there's also times where I'll act out at sea, especially in combat, where if I was to try to describe how I'm holding the sword as I'm trying to block it from somebody else, is that movement actually feasible? And so, yes, there are a lot of sword plays near my desk, and I do have a stack of nerve swords behind me at all times. Which, definitely my cats are appreciative of. But always rewrite the ridiculous.
All right, so just one more thing to keep in mind in terms of dialogue and world building. People talk in the context of knowing things already. So an example of that would be like John and his friend that have lived together for 10 years in the same town. They know everything about the town and happenings. They're probably not going to have a conversation that goes like, remember a year ago when the cops couldn't find that murderer? I wish I didn't, because that just sounds weird. And they know what happened a year ago. So instead of doing something like that, I would suggest trying something with your dialogue tags. So that's all the stuff that comes after the dialogue. So try, remember last year, John asked with a shudder, I wish I didn't, I said, my stomach twisting his words. Because that's going to do so much more for your story, for implying all of this this stuff that's happened in the world, this stuff that happens below the iceberg surface like we were talking about earlier. So when in doubt, just remember, show, don't tell. You can apply a lot of world building through your dialogue.
It's just getting a little more detailed with using language even outside of the dialogue, so even in your prose, it still is very important to your world building. So whether you are just writing your story or you're setting out to create a language or imply other languages, you want to be mindful of the words that you are using. One of my favorite things about language is that it is both a reflection of our culture and a vehicle that drives and shapes it. So in American English, we have countless phrases relating money to food. We are bringing home the bacon, we're gonna go get this bread, or we're rolling in the dough on payday. So the relationship between wealth and food is inextricably tied. Cultures that aren't built around capitalism might not have those expressions if food is just something that they have, or they don't have to get money for food. So they probably wouldn't make that connection. So even if you are translating it, it still wouldn't make very, very much sense. So you also have to take into account any anachronisms that pop up in your story. This is a huge source of debate with a lot of books that are really big right now. And an anachronism is just something that exists in our world but doesn't exist in another world. So in this cool fate, I was using the word champagne, but there is no France, so there's no Champagne region, so I switched to sparkling wine. In my current work in progress, I used Adam's apple, and while there is religion, it's not Christianity, so that doesn't work within the context of the story. So I think there is some suspension of disbelief that readers will have, but if you are relying on them a lot or using very obvious ones, like Adam's apple, I would say is a bit more obvious, it can pull your readers out of the world, and they will notice that. So with that being said, when you are using language, you just want to think about what is important to your people. So for example, the Inuit language has over 50 words for snow because that's such an integral part of their life. So if your culture values beauty, how would they be more likely to describe things? In Germany, the word for bridge is feminine, so German speakers are more likely to describe a bridge as beautiful or elegant, whereas in French it's masculine, so speakers are more likely to describe a bridge as strong or robust, or traditionally like masculine adjectives. Language also informs how we see things like colors, as in the Homer's Odyssey, he describes it as a wine dark sea, whereas today we would use blue or green. So you don't need to have Tolkien levels of language knowledge to still build a believable language, and so Marisa's going to take over with like those specifics of building a language.
My favorite thing. Has anybody here ever tried to build their own language, or even thought about? Yeah. Well, yeah, I kind of think about it. So I've built a language in this series, and I'll get into more of that a little bit as we go on. But Mark Rosenfelder, kind of where I started was with the language construction kit. I've got a bunch of tabs in it. There's so much crap in here, so clearly it's like a Bible to me now. But he has a really good point. He says, why invent thousands of words if 100 would do? So that kind of goes back to focusing on the details you know you need for your story and kind of leaving the rest for now. I mean, you can do it like Tolkien did, where he wrote a whole multiple languages for the elves. He was focusing on their culture. He was drawing from existing languages like Finnish and Old English. Me and my friends used to write notes to each other in that language, so you could use it and do that if you want. My point being is that sitting down and having a whole dictionary for all of those things when you're only going to use a few sentences here and there in your book or your world, it might not be necessary at that point. So if you're just looking to build a language that's believable for the few chapters it shows up in your world, this is kind of how I did it, and this is how I would suggest doing it if you're not sure where to start. So what I did was I started with an IPA chart for English, since English is the language that I am most familiar with. IPA stands for International Phonetic Alphabet, and so what it is it's all these symbols that kind of look like letters, and they stand for different sounds, so like consonants and vowels and all that good stuff. And what I did was I kind of sat with it and I thought about, okay, what do I want my alien language to sound like? And so I went through and I highlighted all of the sounds in English that I wanted to kind of go over to the language of Jahrena, the planet. So what did I want Jahrenian to sound like? And what I was left with was a ton of vowels and a lot of kind of back of the throat guttural sounds you see in like German and like Eastern European languages. So really what I wanted to do was I was like toying with this idea that I knew what the alien race looked like. They're really tall, they're really pretty, they value knowledge above all else. And I was toying with the idea that how their language sounded doesn't kind of match with how they look, because I wanted to create that tension between Jax, the main character, who is not from Jahrena, he's from Andarsha, which is like a subsect of Earth. So I wanted to kind of go from there and create all this tension between him experiencing this culture. He's asking himself, okay, how is this world different from my world? And we're asking ourselves, how are both of these worlds different from Earth, where we all reside, right? So that's what I was left with the IPA chart. That's a great place for you guys to start if you're not sure where to start with building your own language. And again, even if you only need it for a few sentences, building off of languages that already exist is going to make it that much more believable to your readers. That's just because I felt like putting this in. That's an example of what my language looks like. So again, I was going back and forth with this idea of how the alien race looks, how they sound, and how the letters look, and how does that all kind of work together? And again, how is that different from Jax's world? So in that, I was also asking myself, okay, what is important in this culture that I'm creating? What's going to be so important in this culture that kind of influences the language? So like Tolkien, the elves are really they're really into nature, so that influences the elvish languages and stuff. With the Jahrenian language, they don't have direct translations for certain things. So they don't have a word for birth, death, the first season, like every color, and then love. And so when Jax meets them, he's like, okay, well, if you guys, if we're not able to understand each other, if you guys do a translation for love, you must not care about it, right? No, the opposite, fact. They care about it so much, and it's so important to them that they could not possibly have a translation, have a single word for those things. So kind of the opposite of what Maddi was saying with the Inuit people having, snow is really important to their culture. They've got a ton of different words. This stuff is so important to this alien race's culture that they can't possibly have a translation for it. So that's just, I can talk about this all day clearly. That's just kind of where I started. If I brought the book with me, if you guys want to flip through it, super, super helpful. It talks about grammar, phonetics, like how to build your own vocabulary, stuff like that. So you can come flip through it. And really, I just want an excuse to talk to somebody who's also building their own language. So. Kind of going off of that, maps are really big in fantasy worlds specifically. This one's from 4th grade. I'm really excited about the next book coming out, but we won't go into that. So, do you need a map for your world? Probably. The answer is probably yes, you do. Yeah, whether you're using it just as a reference for yourself or if it's in the front flap for your readers to look at, maps are going to be really important for that consistency for you guys for writing and for making sure that you don't forget where this super important building is. That's the issue that I have sometimes because I didn't sit down and have a map when I started building this world. So sometimes I have to go back and be like, okay, is the radio tower west of the city or is it north? And in book 1, if it says it's north, it's got to be north now. And so you don't want to run into that. So.
Isn't there a water pond there?
Yeah, exactly. You don't want to, so learn from my mistakes, build a map, they help you stay consistent. Obviously commissioning an artist is a really awesome way to do that, make it look super pretty like that, exactly how you're picturing it in your head. Couple free options. Inkarnate is a super cool website that you can build maps on. Asgard's fantasy map generator is also free online. If you guys have a printout, I've randomly generated a bunch of blank maps and it's on the back. So if you guys don't have a map for your world yet, or if you just want a starting point for this project or for a future project, Merry Christmas, you guys can use that. Online on Asgard's map generator, you can separate it in different political regions and states and kind of like that, but I just wanted to do the blank map so that like you guys can do what you will with them. But these are what the maps on Incarnate look like. They're a little bit more detailed, so I saved my works printer ink by not printing a bunch of this stuff. Don't tell my boss. But anyways, these, I don't know if you guys have ever, you guys have probably played Zoo Tycoon. But these ones have like different brushes for like trees and like mountains and lakes and stuff like that you can use. I think the one in the corner is like a spaceship type situation, so that's super cool. But this one seems to be more, from what I can tell, more like fantasy kind of outdoor realm situation. So that's a super cool option if you guys want to do something like that. But all right, now that we've thrown a ton of information, I'm seeing tons of people fill out their forms. Yours is like front to back covered already. Now that we've thrown a bunch of information at you guys, once you focus on these three kind of aspects of world building, the world is starting to feel like its own character, right? It's living, it's breathing, your characters know exactly what they're doing in it, and the really cool part about world building and kind of how you know that you're done for now, until you want to add another detail later, but how you know you're done for now is when you're no longer questioning what's going to happen in your world and how your world is functioning as the writer. You're kind of just writing with your characters in your world, and the world is almost like telling you what's going to happen. Yeah. So, pretty cool. So, where do you go from here once you have a world, once you feel like it's its own character? Find readers whose voices you can trust. That's going to be really important aspect of building community. One way that you can do that is you can join a writers group. So me and Maddi co-host Rocky Mountain Writers Guild. It's on Discord. We do like Wednesday night writing sprints. We would love to see some of you guys there. We chat throughout the week too, so it's not just a once a week thing. But Kat also in the back, she does the Tattered cover writing group, book club, stuff like that. So that's a really important way to find readers whose voices you can really trust. So less of like, I read your chapter and I really liked it, and more of like, but the way this character talks doesn't make sense. Like, why is he Southern when this is on a different planet that is not Earth? You know, stuff like that. So another thing you can do is explore all these different resources we talked about today. Not all of us know the details on every single resource, but between the three of us, we all can help answer pretty much any question about it, I would say. And the most important thing is just to practice. So practice writing, practice reading, read what other people have written, kind of see how they're doing their world building, how they're doing their storytelling, and see what you can kind of glean from that. Obviously not like steal their ideas, but like, be inspired by what they're doing.
Yeah, that's what it is. It inspired me.
Yeah. So for now, I'll leave you guys with this quote from Jordan Peele. He says, "When I'm writing a first draft, I'm constantly reminding myself that I'm simply shoveling sand into a box so that later I can build castles." So that quote, I loved it so much that I wrote the word sand castles, and I put it on my bulletin board to the place where I always kind of zone off when I'm having trouble writing a scene or building a world. When I'm like, oh, maybe I shouldn't be a writer anymore. I look at that and then I remind myself, it's fine, we're just putting sand into a box, and later we're gonna build the castle into what we want it to be. We're gonna build the world into exactly what we need it to be to tell the story we're trying to write.
So there are so many resources that you can use to help organize world building information, drafting stories, and formatting if you are looking to self-publish. So World Anvil is basically like a create your own wiki, so you can just kind of house all of your world building information in there and separate it. I use Notion, which is similar, just not world building dedicated. Incarnate and Asgard's Fantasy Map Generator, of course, for the maps. And then Final Draft, Art Studio, Novel Models, Writer Solo, Reedsy, and Scrivener are all like writing, like basically like a Word document folder. Final Draft and Scrivener are one-time payments. Final Draft is just for drafting. Scrivener, you can also do a lot of world building and character building. It's a very large program. Art Studio and Novel Goggles are paid with a monthly subscription, and I believe that both of those are also just for drafting. Writer Solo and Reedsy are free, and they offer novel formatting to export into book form and not just like work in progress form.
In fact, this entire book was made in
Mine too.
I used vellum. And reference books are great as long as you don't only use reference books. Just remember to read other books as well. But if you're looking for some good reference books, there's Making Shapely Fiction by Jerome Stern, and that is just a good overview of building a story and especially focusing on the pacing, which can be very tricky to like nail. Number 2, The Anatomy of Story by John Truby. This is my holy grail of a reference book. John Truby's students wrote Shrek, which is a cinematic masterpiece. So I don't think it needs further, there's everything you could possibly need, and he speaks in a way that is very succinct yet easy to understand, and goes through the elements of story, touching on the world he's created and really using that world as a character. Wired for Story by Lisa Cron, which I referenced earlier. What I really like about this one is it goes into the science of why we are so in tune to story, because that is a storytelling survived from, or grew from survival for humanity. So we are wired to recognize and like connect with stories. If I am in a car accident, you know, parts of my brain will light up, and if I read about someone in a car accident, those same parts of my brain light up. So it's very interesting, and it goes into how we can use that connection to story to craft really impactful and unforgettable stories. It's why I write by George Orwell. It goes into writing about dystopias and reflecting the culture that we are in. He's obviously a huge voice in the genre. He has a whole subgenre of dystopia, so a very good resource if you want to explore dystopian elements at all. And then of course the Language Construction Kit by Mark Rosenfelder to create a language that makes sense.
And we did bring all these books, so if you guys want to flip through them before you go upstairs and buy them text, you can do that. Just don't steal them, because we need them.
Yes.
All right, any questions? If there are no questions, I guess that means we did a really thorough restaurant. Yes.
So in pieces of dialogue, you talk a lot about like what characters say and how to get that, like why they're saying something. How do you decide what they want to say? The things that they hide, and the things that like, as an author, you would know they know, and why they don't speak.
A lot of that probably go with their manners and behaviors.
Yeah, that's
Is
what I
this specific character purposely hiding information, and if so, why? Yeah, why?
I think you can also add in like tells. So if you have a character that isn't your POV character where we know they're telling the truth, maybe they are not making eye contact with the POV character, playing with their hair or doing like a nervous habit, that you don't even have to have the POV character like directly notice it. So it's kind of in the back of the reader's heads, but it's not, you know, you're not having to be like, they're a liar, you know, just letting it like flow naturally.
She said, well, twirling her hair.
I know.
Yeah. And how your POV character reacts to those tells. Like, are they looking at it as just, oh, something that's happening, or are they interpreting it as that person is nervous or they're hiding something, you know? I think that's probably how I would approach it. It's tough when you're just writing from one point of view. Yeah.
And that can also inform your point of view character. Are they seeing the best in people or seeing the worst in people? So they like, oh, they're just nervous, or if they're like cynical, then
What are you hiding?
Yeah. My next book is over from third person singer. It's only from a single point of view. And he actually makes comments for himself on the things he observes when he thinks in someone's mind. Sometimes he's wrong, sometimes he's right.
How about you in the back?
How do you find the Goldilocks zone for bringing history into your world? Like it could be, your world could be completely built on its own history, but there's some spontaneous things that happen.
Yeah,
How do you find
totally.
that?
Gosh, that's a really good question. You guys feel free to jump in too, because I'm not having an immediate answer.
I think it's like, are you asking like as you are writing the story, like in chapter 1, you originally think there's only this one big event that you're focusing on, and by the time you get to chapter like 12, like, oh no, this other event had to have happened, or like understanding the history and letting those come in at different times?
Well, I'm more wondering how far back and how detailed do you make the history of your world? Do you do the Tolkien thing and plan out
Got
the
it.
entire world, or do you just kind of fly by the seat of your pants?
Like with Kingmaker, there is history to it, what leads up to what happens in the book. That happened about 300 years prior. And throughout the book, I drop little bits of why it happened. I don't go through the whole, it's not a single chapter that's the entire backstory, but more of a drip effect, where they'll comment about certain people's action 300 years prior. And then as the book progresses, you start putting it together that, oh, this is what caused all this other stuff to happen. So you don't necessarily have to go into the entire.
I like to have a general idea, and I have a section in my Notion for the past where I'll just write important like events and things like that. But I don't think that it has to be very in depth, because even like if I think, what do I know of world history, it's not very detailed unless I'm actively researching one niche subject. You know, so I don't think you have to like stress out if you don't know who killed who to secede the line of like, you know, you can just be like, there was a coup, or, you know, so you don't have to tear your hair out trying to figure it out, just as long as you have like a rough idea. Because people are pretty spotty.
And you flesh it out as you write.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily have to do it all right now. Like with Kingmaker, I didn't build a single part of that world. It began to develop as I was writing. So like, I should have made a map, but I didn't. And I'm suffering for it now that I'm almost done with the second book. But so how it happened is that I started off, and then I just kept adding more bits to it as I went. And then so the history of what they keep referring to just kept growing as a story. So I didn't even know what was going on.
Yeah, that's kind of how I approached it with my world as well. Like I knew that obviously they're coming from Earth and they're colonizing these other planets, so I knew the things that took place for them to leave Earth, which was kind of just like climate change. We gotta go, you know? And so from that point I was kind of able to build out from there, but I like the history of their world is limited because the reader doesn't need to know much more than they left Earth because they ruined it, and now they're doing the same thing to their new planet. And like those are the two most important things that are a part of this history going into it. And obviously there's a ton of other layers to it, but those are just like, those just are things that live in my notebooks that didn't make it into here. So I think it's okay if you even as a writer like don't know, you know, who was the president 50 years ago, whatever. Like, if it's not important to the story you're telling right now, I don't think it's necessarily something to worry about. So that's kind of how I've approached it and found to work really well. So, I hope that answers.
Yes, thank you.
So I'll be more hands when
I had a question about, excuse me, the iceberg.
Mhm.
And then you get nosy people that are like, well, what about this? Well, what about that? And you start to feel like maybe you're not giving enough subtext.
Sure.
How have you experienced that, and how do you deal with that and kind of draw that line?
Yes, I have experienced that. We'll start there.
I mean, I think it kind of just, it's tough, and I'm still learning it, but I think it kind of goes back to just trusting yourself as a writer and as a creator, and knowing the things that are the most important for your reader to know in your world. And like, I mean, I've experienced that as a reader too. Like, I want to know, I'm so into the Hunger Games, guys. I want to know, like, she could publish 27 more books and I would still be unhappy. Like, it would still not feel like enough. Like, I want to know all that information, but the stories are just like what they are, you know? So I don't, yeah, it's tough.
I think what I would, and I think this is true for any choice you make with your story, world building, whatever, you just have to get to a point where you're comfortable defending it. So if you have information that you are purposefully omitting for whatever reason, or that you think is important to include, like, that's the important thing, because you don't know how people are going to perceive your work. And no, if you tried and you listen to every reference book and you listen to every single like best-selling author, whatever, you can't make everyone happy, no matter how hard you try. So I think just getting to a point where it's like, I've made the decisions that serve my story and that it feels complete to me, and I can defend this, even if someone is like, well, actually, you didn't say what they eat for breakfast, so it doesn't matter, you know, like, because you can't make them happy. So you just have to do what feels complete to you, and that might be a little vague, but I think it just comes down to like, yeah, trusting your gut as the creator and saying like, this is what's important, and that's all that needs to be in here.
That's my son keeps bugging me about certain parts of Kingmaker that are actually going to be revealed in the next book.
Also,
So I tell him, read the next book.
Yeah, yeah. I do get a lot of people that are like, oh, you didn't answer this question by the end of this book, and I'm like, well, there's 2 more books after that. You never know what's going to happen. So,
Part of a series.
yeah, exactly.
I have just to answer that too, my background is in marketing and acquisitions and publishing. And I'm always thinking, when you get a situation like that, what can you pull and save for later to use as a marketing tool? So if somebody's like, oh, that'd be really cool to learn about that, save it for something later. You can write it out later and use it as like, subscribe to my email list and get a free, you know, like little things like that. You can pull, never delete anything. Pull it, save it somewhere else, because it's probably you could use it later.
So on that note, I have had people ask me about origin stories for some of the characters in the book. So I'm doing that, but I don't know if I want to do it in the book or do it in the newsletter.
It can be a separate thing. Yep.
I was going to ask something kind of similar to what you just mentioned. Even if you don't reveal this information to the public or in your books, how deeply do you really create your characters, like a biography just for yourself?
For me, I keep it relevant to the story. Like 1874 is my next book. If that's what it's based on, I'm saying 1874. What's the flavor Starbucks does he drink? Who knows? There's no Starbucks in 1874. So I keep the details for that character relevant.
I kind of do a little bit of the opposite of that. I go ham with the characters, and I have like a whole questionnaire that is like, if a song played every time this character walked in the room, what would it be? Because I just think that's really fun, and I feel like that helps me know the character inside and out before I'm even writing them. And like, of course, I'm never going to mention that song in the book, but like, I really like including, I'm knowing all that information for myself.
I'm just in the middle.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I like to write like their life history, just kind of following like what was their family life like as a child, what any formative experiences they had when they were young. And I also like to I list out their like focus in the story, like are they protagonist, antagonist, an ally, and then any archetypes that they have. So if they are like a mentor type archetype, warrior, and then I also go through their Myers-Briggs type. So that's a different kind of, it's because it's not quite a questionnaire, but it just forces me to think in their perspective, like what would this character do in this situation? And then it just kind of gives me like a guiding pathway to like decide, oh, if this character is getting chased, are they gonna run or are they gonna like fight back or something, you know? So it just kind of helps me differentiate them from me.
And adding to that, it can also help for like marketing purposes. So you might see a really fun reel, like a song as a character, and might attract readers to buy your book because they like that song, because they like the aesthetic, or what kind of flower it is, what kind of season. So if you want to go super, super deep into it, it can just be for marketing purposes.
Yeah,
And not
for sure.
actually the story.
I feel like that kind of helps people relate to the characters more that way too, just even from Instagram posts. Anyone else? Yes.
Okay, so you talked about creating original languages, but how do you feel about using existing languages in your books, like using real world languages in your fantasy setting?
Do you mean like using, like, I have a fantasy world and the language spoken is like German?
Yeah, I guess
Okay.
something like
Something like that, I would change it. Like I talked about
Yeah.
earlier, about taking Latin and then twisting it, like I'll add an I or an it or a Y sound at the end. But like you take something like German and grind it up even more.
Yeah, I'm reading a book, I cannot think of the name of it right now, probably, you know, but it's a fantasy book and it kind of is based on like Spain type culture and stuff, so they're using a lot of like words of like the Romance languages and stuff like that, and it works really well for that, so I don't think it's necessarily like a bad idea to do that. I think it helps if you speak that language as well, so like I only speak English and like one semester of high school Spanish. That's what I'm working with, but I don't think it's necessarily like, make sure the culture exists in the book. I think that would work. That's what I would say.
I know all the bad stuff. They're not playing different.
Yeah.
I think it boils down to like, again, what are you willing to defend?
Yeah.
Like, because people are going to have thoughts regardless. So if you're using an existing language, I think you can, like, is it from a culture that has received a lot of, like, is it an oppressed minority group? And if you don't belong to those groups, you know, are you going to use the language without changing anything about it? Or I know there was like a huge controversy with Fourth Wing where she didn't use Gaelic, but she said she used Gaelic, so people were like commenting on that, just a kind of like a misappropriation of the language. So again, I think it boils down to like, what are you comfortable with and what are you willing to defend?
Adding to that, in relation to the story culture, it can also be like an old version of the language, old English, old
that's
German.
true, yeah.
As far back as you want to go, like maybe your story existed in that period of time. Or any details you might want to add, like depends on the culture.
Yeah.
Old English is a good one too, because we go pretty far back.
Yeah.
Even 200 or 300 years ago, the way they spelled things was way different.
Yeah.
A lot of fast sounds and, yeah.
Whatever the
And we're
Vikings
English
spoke.
speakers, so we belong to those groups.
Yeah, that's
So I think the elves and Lord of the Rings sound more French.
yeah.
Just thought-
Yeah. Anyone else?
And just as snobby.
Yeah. Going once, going twice. If you have a question you don't feel quite brave enough to ask in a room full of people, you can come talk to us individually. Well, cool. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. This has been super, super fun. Thank you, Kat. Thanks, Kat and Cover. We're going to be hanging out up here for a little bit, so come chat with us.
Look before I find the bathroom.
Yeah, accessibility.
Whoa. Thank you guys for joining us. Sorry if you couldn't hear it very well. There was nothing I really do, but we'll see what happens.